Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Research Roundtable. I saw Amelia there for a second. The IOCDS live stream that focuses on an interesting topic within the research and then discusses it with the folks who know it best. My name is Kyle King. I'm a first-year medical student at the Yale University School of Medicine. I'm interested in psychiatry and neuroscience and a whole bunch of different things. But most specifically, I'm interested in OCD. Not just because I think it's a really fascinating disorder, but also because I have it. So a lot of the things that we discuss on the show are personally relevant to me. The topic we're going to be discussing today is particularly relevant to me. But before I introduce the topic, I want to pass it off to my co-host, Jon Abramowitz, so he can introduce himself as well.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm Jon Abramowitz. I'm a professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I study OCD, and I work with folks, treat folks who have OCD, and do lots of research with my team on how to understand it better and how to treat it and all of that. And I am very excited. We have an all-star cast of folks today, so I'm very excited for this discussion.
Yeah. No, it's going to be a fun one. Today, our topic is OCD in the family. And if you're an avid watcher of the show, you're probably thinking, but wait, Kyle, we already talked about this. That's correct. We did already talk about this. We had a part 1 of OCD in the family, and we talked about a whole number of things in that conversation, like multifamily support groups and the space program and family accommodation. But at the end of the conversation, we realized that we didn't hit nearly enough because OCD in the family, that kind of tag, is a super broad concept. And we focused on only certain relationships within families, and only kind of certain dynamics within those relationships. So we wanted to have a part 2 and talk about more OCD and the family-related topics. Before I introduce our panelists who are going to be doing the majority of the talking, I do have a couple announcements that I got to make. First, this live stream is educational and is not intended to replace therapy. For treatment-related questions, please work with your provider or contact a local clinician. You can use the IOCDF's online resource directory at iocdf.org/find-help to locate a trained clinician near you. Second, the IOCDF is not a crisis hotline. If you're in crisis or if you're ever feeling suicidal or unsafe, please call the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline by dialing 988. You can also access this online at www.988lifeline.org or go to your local emergency room or call 911. Second, or third, I suppose, there's a live chat feature. We love when you put questions in there. We're going to try to get to as many questions in the live chat as possible. We just want everyone to be super aware that this is a live stream and will go on the internet and will live on the internet forever. So be respectful in the live chat, although we've never had any particular problems. Also, a special announcement. This Valentine's Day, we're showing love and raising funds for OCD research. So donate directly to support studies that advance our understanding and treatment of OCD-related disorders, plus any donation for a limited time of $20 or more will receive a limited edition iHeart Research sticker, and $100 or more will receive an iHeart Research tote bag. And it's a very sweet sentiment because I do heart research. Okay, that's enough of my voice. I'll go ahead and start introducing our guests. The first bio I have here on my computer is Christine Durso. Christine Durso, PhD, is a senior psychologist at Northwell House OCD Center at Zucker Hillside Hospital in Queens, New York. Christine oversees psychology and psychiatry training and created and leads multifamily therapy groups at the OCD Center that target family accommodation of OCD. She and her husband live in Brooklyn and have an adorable and rambunctious mini golden doodle puppy named Jojo. Christine, how you doing?
That's right. Very good. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for agreeing to spend another hour with us.
Yeah. And don't worry, Jojo is downstairs, so he will not be involved. He will not be barking. You will not hear him crying for attention, but he is very cute.
Honestly, like I don't know why you think that I wouldn't want him to interrupt.
Like, he can be a little annoying.
Like you can bring him in. It's fine.
Good to know.
Our second guest, Dr. Lisa Coyne, is a senior clinical consultant at McLean OCD Institute for Children and Adolescents at McLean Hospital and assistant professor at Harvard Medical School. She is the executive director of the New England Center for OCD and Anxiety, NACOA, and is the past president of the Association of Contextual Behavioral Science. She's a member of the Clinical and Scientific Advisory Board and is on the faculty of the Behavioral Therapy Training Institute at the International OCD Foundation. She's also a licensed psychologist, a peer-reviewed ACT trainer, and author. She's authored multiple articles and chapters on parenting and ACT in children, adolescents, and family. So she's a good person having this conversation. She also lives in Massachusetts at Mudflower Farms with an assortment of horses, bunnies, and her dog, Dougal, the Doog Lebowski. Lisa, what is
Thank
that a
you,
reference
Kyle.
to?
What?
What is the Doog a reference to? Or is it a reference
Oh, the Doog abides. And if you'd like to see the Doog abiding, there he is, abiding.
Okay. I don't
Kyle,
quite know what it means to say a dog abides, but
It's the Big Lebowski, Kyle.
Yes, the Big Lebowski.
Okay. Was that? I feel like that's been recommended to me a couple times, but I've never seen a
Now
dog.
you have
named
to watch
after
it.
You should definitely.
Now
watch.
you have to watch it.
Okay. Our third and final guest is Professor Eli Lebowitz. Professor Lebowitz studies and treats childhood and adolescent anxiety at the Yale Child Study Center. His research focuses on the development, neurobiology, and treatment of anxiety and related disorders, with a special emphasis on family dynamics and the role of the parents in these problems. Dr. Lebowitz is the lead investigator on multiple funded research projects and is the author of over 100 research papers, books, and chapters on childhood and adolescent anxiety. He's also the father of 3 great boys. And I mean, based any dogs, like there's no mention of them in the bio. We had 2 dogs already.
We do have a dog
Just
as
say the
well.
dogs.
We
Okay.
do have a dog as well. So 1 girl in addition to the 3 boys, I guess. We have a dog.
And what's the name? Because JoJo's pretty solid. The Doog is very solid.
Well, I don't know if it's solid. Her name is Misa.
Oh, I love
Oh,
that.
I like that.
Misa.
That's a cute name.
It's a
Great name.
roundabout. It's also a roundabout movie reference, but in a very indirect way. So maybe not easy to guess.
I don't have a dog, but if I did, its name would be Pavlov.
Ah, see, that's good.
Very good.
Well, I've been regretting not calling her Peeve, because then she could actually be my pet peeve.
Oh, your pet peeve. Oh, that's good. I'm going to steal that.
That should be a dad joke somewhere.
I'm sure it is somewhere.
That's a good dad joke.
Hey, at least your dad and he made it. It is technically a dad joke.
It really is.
I'm dad through and through.
So, we're talking about dads. Let's jump into the family stuff.
Good
just to
segue,
kind of-
Kyle. Good segue.
Nice
Thank
job.
you. What can I say? I'm a professional. So we did this show before, and we kind of laid out what OCD in the family means. But if folks who are on the stream now didn't watch that first segment, I kind of want to go around and pick each of your brains really quickly. When I say OCD in the family, like that's the topic of our live stream, and you read that in the email. What does your brain jump to as like, this is what the stream is going to be talking about? These are the most pressing issues when someone says OCD and the family. And I'll pick on Lisa first.
Okay. So OCD is an interpersonal process. I'm going to say all the things that Ellie and Christine are going to say. So thank you for asking me first.
Okay.
But they're not going
We're gonna have to
anyway.
think of something original.
I know. Think of something original. It reshapes families in ways that can be, on the face of it, it looks like it's a helpful thing, but actually creates more of a problem for the person who is suffering from OCD, right? And let me just say that when it reshapes families, right, we all influence each other when we're in groups. And in a closed family system, it's an interpersonal process. If there's a human that you love who's experiencing distress, the natural response is, let me help you with that distress. Let me try and take it from you, right? That makes sense. However, in terms of how it works for OCD, it does something different. And I'll leave off there so one of the other panelists can take that part. How's that?
Good. Very generous.
I was just thinking the same.
Christine, I'll let you pick up.
Yeah. So I was waiting, Lisa, to hear more, but I guess I'll just have to take it from there.
We're going to tag.
Yes. So
Yep.
with that said, right, I think what I find most fascinating is, we have family members also in distress, looking at their loved ones suffering with OCD. They are compelled to provide the accommodation that is often requested. They're, often giving reassurance, or they are taking part in rituals. And what I find so fascinating, though, is when we target the role of the family, and we do this in my group, which I hope to talk more about, we are basically asking everyone in the family to do exposure, right? So everyone's united. You're either the person with OCD being asked to do ERP and, not do a compulsion, or you're the family member essentially being asked to do ERP, not providing the accommodation. And, everyone is learning to tolerate their distress. I'll leave it at that.
Well said.
So it seems like, when you two first hear OCD and the family, your brains jump to like OCD as being kind of this inter-family system where there's a person with OCD, but then they ask for reassurance, they ask for accommodation, or just generally they can, the fact that the disorder is there and the family members have to watch someone they love struggle with something is just very distressing. It can have ripple effects where not only do the behaviors of those around the person with OCD can reinforce can reinforce the OCD or help treat it, but also like it can lead to issues. I would imagine in the people who are around us, like around the person with OCD, just because they're under such
Causes
stress
a ton
as
of
well.
distress.
Oh yeah.
It's almost like OCD hijacks the sufferer and then holds them for ransom, and the family members feel like they need to accommodate to make sure everything ends up okay. But unfortunately, that actually gives OCD the upper hand and causes it to stay around a little bit longer.
And I want to point out the comment Bargain Beauty just made in the chat, that family is not always supportive or want to help. It often distances you from loved ones when you have OCD. Yeah, I imagine that's
Very
something
true.
that you guys also see in clinical practices or research setting.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And it's really different for different families too.
Yeah, I guess we can go into, there's so many things to go into.
Yeah.
But Ellie, I don't want to alienate you off in the corner of my screen. What do you think of when you hear OCD in the family? And say something novel.
Well, I didn't feel alienated. Actually, I think there are a lot of different directions that people just could take that headline of OCD and the family. My brain does also go a lot in the direction of accommodations and things like that. There are other directions also. For example, genetics of OCD, right? Like that's another OCD and the family topic that is a whole other world of like research and more unknowns than knowns, but falls under that that umbrella. I also did appreciate the comment from is it Bargain?
I think Bargain Beauty. Yeah.
Because I think as much as we do want to, help our loved ones, etc., OCD can also drive a lot of wedges between family members, can really sometimes be very destructive to family relationships, whether that's between parents and children, whether that's between siblings, whether that's between spouses or partners. There's a lot of potential for disruption, not just enmeshment, but also disruption. And also, I think it's important to remember that family is not a monolithic concept either, because families differ a lot, whether because of cultural backgrounds that are very different across ethnicities and cultures. Families function in very different ways, and the makeup of families is, a heterogeneous concept. And so we're really, you can't really talk about this just as, kind of like a simple thing or make assumptions about families without taking into consideration the really broad range of what it means for human beings to be families and to have OCD within that family system.
Which is precisely why this stream is in some ways really difficult, because like no matter what rabbit hole we go down, I feel like we're excluding like, oh, well, we're not talking about siblings, or we're not talking about the relationship between a mother and a father if a kid has OCD, or between like a mother and a father if one of them has OCD. Like there's so many different variants and ways in which OCD can affect family. And like you said, family's not a monolith either. And then we could extend that just to kind of general relationships as well. but we need to start somewhere. So I kind of want to focus in on Bargain Beauty's comment, actually, because I think that's really interesting and probably something that's just not talked about enough. So in your guys' experience, including you, Jon, I don't want to leave you out. How kind of what's the split, or how do families typically respond to OCD? Like, I'm sure some people are like, oh, well, I'm going to do everything I can to support my loved one. Sometimes that leads to accommodation, sometimes it may not. I imagine it also can drive wedges. So like, I guess what do you guys see in practice? And then what are some kind of predictors maybe of which way a family system may lean?
Well, and sometimes you'll see within one family, if it's two parents, one parent feels one way, right? I'm going to stand up to OCD. I'm not going to let OCD, rule the family. And then the other parent is, but our child is so anxious. We have to accommodate them and do what they want us to do, which can even make things more complicated.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. And I would even say within one person, you can often see
that's right.
Pendulum swing or like a bit of a yo-yo between different postures toward the OCD, because how you respond to a person's OCD when you're feeling, energized, refreshed, and have a lot of spare time may be very different from how you respond when you have a toothache and are feeling irritable and are tired and don't have time, or when the symptom is different as well. One of the ways in which OCD can sometimes drive those wedges is when the symptoms actually center on another person in the family. Oh, yeah. For example, it's not rare to feel like contact with another person in your family is itself harmful to you, even if, maybe rationally you do or don't know that's like doesn't really make a lot of sense. But if you feel contaminated by that person or in some way, vulnerable to exposure to them, that can lead to a lot of avoidance, which can be experienced as very deep rejection. When that happens, it's very easy for that to drive a wedge. I have an anecdote that kind of brings that to life, but I don't want to take up too much of the time. I don't know if other people want to weigh in on this.
Well, do we know? I was going to ask, do we know? I know in our lab, I have a grad student actually who Ellie knows very well, who's doing some research to try to figure out predictors of how parents, in this case, respond to their kids, sometimes adult children with anxiety and OCD. What does the research tell us about predictors of how people respond?
Not enough.
Yeah.
As with many questions, the answer is not enough. We know that on the one hand, we know that some level of what we call accommodation of OCD symptoms is ubiquitous. It is so common. It's actually rare to find, a parent in particular, if it's their child, but even if it's a spouse or a sibling, it's actually rare to find no accommodation of symptoms. But also there is variability, and trying to understand what determines that variability is actually kind of a hard task. We were talking about how families are not, monolithic, how culture varies. There's, an interesting paper that Laura Seligman published, I think, a year or two ago, that looked at ethnicity, like Hispanic families and non-Hispanic families, and was finding some really interesting. I could maybe share a link if I get a second in the chat to people who want to find that, actually read that paper. But found, for example, some pathways linking Hispanic versus non-Hispanic ethnicity to child anxiety symptoms through levels of accommodation. And so you see this kind of playing out in really interesting and complex ways. We know that a person's own level of anxiety also a person's own
Yes.
level of distress tolerance, their
Correct.
beliefs about the anxiety or OCD. These things can all go into shaping. Are you going to be more accommodating or less accommodating?
Exactly.
That we don't know as well.
And I think just as OCD is a stress sensitive issue, right? It is the same as, I think it's the same for families who are accommodating and who are engaged. And the more distressed and more willing to experience that distress, those are two variables that can impact someone's willingness to resist accommodating, as Christine mentioned earlier, as exposure for parents. In our clinic, we're actually, one of our students, Regina Roberg, is doing her dissertation on looking at the impact of a valuing intervention on both supportive communication in families as well as autonomy granting. And so we're trying to look at, when parents are feeling anxious themselves, or struggling with that distress tolerance themselves, are there interventions that we can use that will help them consistently apply those skills that we know are useful, and grant autonomy to folks with OCD so that they can learn their strengths?
I guess I want to know kind of more about that. And Christine, I imagine you kind of have some thoughts on it. Like, what are the tools you can give a parent, let's say, of a child who's struggling with OCD, to help them moderate distress tolerance themselves?
Well, first, hearing what Lisa said made me think back to actually a presentation that I did with co-leaders a couple years ago for the Southern California OCD conference. And we actually were finding that particularly in our families where we had the patient who was a young adult, maybe ranging from 18 to 24, we didn't just see the role of OCD, but we also saw a lot of that failure to launch phenomenon happening. So we really just were able, really get to know these families. We're meeting every week, but we really saw, aside from OCD, and this really, could have come from non-OCD factors as well, just really the young adults' tendency to just be very dependent in general on the parent and to really not be very focused on their own autonomy as an adult, right? So we actually started factoring that into the behavior contracts that we would come up with, which we can talk a little bit more about. And when we really found that made a difference too, because of course, as we're saying, OCD is part of the family dynamic. It's part of the person's life. The whole point of any intervention is to just get the person satisfied with how they're living their life. So it was really a very interesting thing to get to go more into homework assignments that might have involved, young adults still living at home, learning to do chores, learning to get an allowance. And part of the allowance system also involved, right? Doing ERP homework, not asking for reassurance. We had plenty of parents who we would say, don't go filling up so-and-so's gas tank in their car, right? Like that is actually not super related to OCD, but it's not helping your daughter, for example, learn to have to be more independent. So that was a bit tangentially answering your question, Kyle. But yeah, that would just be an example of some tactics that we use that are a little bit different from more of our classic, hey, identify the accommodation, let's pull back the accommodation.
And on our end, we talk a lot about in our clinic playing the long game in parenting, because OCD has this quality where it brings your attention just to the crisis in front of you for a lot of parents, and that takes up all of your windshield. That's all you see. And so one of our skills that we try to teach is to pause, notice that, and step back and think about, what is the broader purpose of my parenting? What is important to me as a parent? And usually parents land somewhere with I want to raise kids who are flexible, who are independent, who are resilient, etc. And then we teach them to act from that place, to let that guide what they do. And it might not be, let me do this for you you, or let me take this distress from you, but rather let me be with you in that distress. Let me empathize with you in that distress. And let me express that I believe you can handle this. I see how hard this is, and you can move forward. And I'm going to kind of step back and let you give it a go.
This concept of like introducing autonomy, or kind of baking that into like a treatment plan is interesting. I hadn't really thought about it. How do you, as providers, know when to start like saying like, yes, you need to be more autonomous? Because I imagine there's cases where the OCD is so severe, like that's not the concern at the moment. Yeah, and like from the research side, like what do we know about if kind of putting someone out in the real world could be detrimental because they're not ready for it?
I thought you were going to ask something different. And I was going to, when you asked about like, when do you know if it's okay to start granting autonomy? I was thinking about the costs, the emotional costs.
Oh, well, yeah,
that
as well.
Right. And just thinking about how hard it is and how responsible they often make themselves for the outcome of this young person. When the fact of the matter is that in any family, parents are out, we are not in control of outcome at all. Right. Mm-hmm. All we can do, is sort of set the stage to make sure that kids have the skills that they need, right? So sort of gardening, right? Making sure you have all of the ingredients that you need to go out into the world. And then when you come home, you are supported and seen, right? So it's really tough. And I don't think it's for the parents to decide for a kid, adult or child, whether it's the right time or whether for them to go out into the world. I think that happens naturally if parents start to just think carefully about what are the things that I want to shape here, what sort of independence or resilience with warmth, right, and firmness. Kids will start to take those steps. And actually another really great tool that is important for parents is to model themselves, right? Mm-hmm. And just to go back to what Ellie said about genetics of OCD, it's not unlikely that one of the parents has an issue with anxiety or OCD, right? Mm-hmm. And so how are we doing as parents with our own distress? And what are we modeling in terms of what we do with this distress for our kids, right? So I think that we can talk about families in a very mechanistic way, right? Like parent does this so the child does that, but it doesn't always, that's not always meaningful. Right? It's more important to think about how do we create a context for growth, right? Where we can shape bravery, where we can shape these things. Not that it's a one-to-one relationship. If I do this, this child will do that, nor should we expect that to happen. But how can we set up a situation where it's harder for OCD to stay, right?
Mm-hmm. Christine, if you have any, or John, if you have anything to add.
Well, so do you need to see the Doog again? He's moved. He's sleeping.
The Doog is very inspiring.
He's right. There we go. He moved. The rug really ties the room together. So
you pointed to genetics. I wonder about factors in the environment. Are things like COVID, for example. Mm-hmm. Right, where we, everyone was at home, and there was more, hooligan mama talks about protection, right? Arguably, folks were protected from lots of anxiety in the outside world because they spent, a couple of years, kids, and adults too, at home. Do we think that, and not just COVID, but also other environmental factors? It seems like there's more like safetyism out there today than there was, let's say, a generation ago. When I was growing up, we played outside. Yeah. No one checked.
We drank from the hose.
You sound like my grandpa.
My parents had no idea where we were most of the time. We were in the woods.
Yeah. So, have those changes in society? Do we think that has any impact on how
rates
families
of development of OCD, or
maybe, or the way that families interact around it and maybe maintain it.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Really interesting point.
I would love to see research on that, but I would suspect the answer is yes, right? There's this sort of, and especially like, so I'm in Boston, and we see lots of families where they're like, my child has to go to the right school to get to Harvard or Yale, and they have to get these grades and do this stuff, and everybody's overscheduled. And childhood becomes this extremely controlled, pressured thing, right? And there's not a lot of freedom to go out and experience the world and try things and learn who you are and discover things, right?
And
through
fail.
trial and error learning, and fail and pull yourself up. Those are necessary experiences, right? Yeah. So I agree with that. I don't know.
I would temper it.
Of course. No, I'm just kidding.
You would say that.
What do you think?
That's what this is about. We should have good, lively discussion. What do you think?
Go on, Ellie.
Well, I guess I would say a couple of things. One is, I think there's always somebody who thinks they've cracked the code for how you should parent children. And there's always new parents and a new market for people who are interested in learning the code for how to parent children, and that's great. It reflects, the care and investment that we have in our children and how much we want to do right by them. But I also think that, I'll put it this way: if your child is not predisposed to developing OCD, if they don't have that innately, really, if they don't have that vulnerability and tendency or predisposition, I think it is very unlikely that your style of parenting, be it a more protective, hovery, helicopter, low autonomy granting parent, or free range, very autonomy granting, hands-off style of parenting, I actually think it's quite unlikely that is going to cause them to develop OCD if in the absence of that tendency. And so I'm saying it because I do think sometimes it gets, it's important to think about parenting, and there's merits and good things to pretty much every approach. Right, and sometimes things go a little bit to the one extreme or the other extreme. There's also a little bit of a pendulum swing over decades from the more hands-on, the more hands-off. There's something to be said for, there's good aspects and maybe less good aspects to all of it. But I think it's really easy when you start thinking that way to also start feeling like, well, yeah, of course, this kid never had a chance. Look at the parents. They're so like this or they're so like that. Mm-hmm. And I think that is probably in most cases not really going to hold up to intense scrutiny of is that actually why this person has OCD? I would say if your kid has OCD, I don't think it's because you were this kind of parent or that kind of parent. I do think that if your kid has OCD or does have that predisposition, then I think how you react. What are you teaching them about handling that distress? What are you showing them about their ability to cope with that vulnerability and how they approach those challenges? I think that is going to matter and to have some impact on what is that problem going to look like in their life. But it's really different from the idea that that's why they have the, the problem.
Fair point. Go ahead.
Just really quick, that reminds me of that book that came out, in the early 90s or late 90s by Judith Risch Harris, The Nurture Assumption, where she kind of looked at all of the developmental literature. And guess what? A lot of what we do as parents doesn't matter unless it's on the extremely harsh and abusive end. Peers actually in childhood have a bigger influence on how kids turn out. So I'm with Ellie on that. At the same time, I do think it's important, modeling is important. And we can influence behavior, right? We can influence the skill acquisition, the speed at which it comes. We can make the learning of particular skills more salient or more desirable if it's something that's reinforced in the families. But I'll shut up, John. I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, not at all. Fair point. I mean, and I think we can all agree that the exact precise cause of OCD we don't know what it is.
Right.
It's probably a combination of factors, and it's probably a different combination of factors for each person. And so we're talking about influences, whether it's biological, environmental, family, learning histories, all sorts of stuff. There's no way to, piece that apart. I don't think we'll get to the bottom of that, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I do think causally, it seems unlikely that you can say X parenting behavior leads to these OCD symptoms, and there's a causal mechanism that's very neat and pretty. But is there nothing in the literature that would suggest, this is at least predictive of OCD severity or the development of OCD, this parental behavior, this parental style? Is there I guess a hint at some correlative evidence? And that doesn't mean too much. I agree, John, but still
there are some, I'm going to look up there were some studies maybe a decade ago, different. Yeah. Keep talking. I'm going to.
Yeah. And I think in terms of etiology, that's really hard. And I think it's sort of a false dichotomy to say genetics versus your family environment. Very difficult to tease apart. But I do think that there are lots of studies that look at the influence of, parenting behavior on child behavior, and even things like treatment expectancy can play a role. Like our ideas about what is going to work can be important, right? So there's lots of studies on things like that suggest that we can influence outcomes in that way, or that parenting behavior is related to change, or changes in parenting behavior are related to changes in child outcome. Experimentally, like a one-to-one relationship, that's very rare and hard to study, right?
Yeah.
And certainly once you do have OCD, going back to the beginning of this conversation around accommodation, I think that we can say fairly, pretty definitively at this point, is that high levels of accommodation are poor predictors of outcome, meaning not poor predictors, they're good predictors, but they predict poor outcome.
Right.
They predict poor outcome, meaning if all other things being equal, if somebody is being accommodated a lot, they are less likely to benefit from treatments. And that's actually held across different kinds of treatment, including even pharmacological, like medication treatment, as well as things like exposure and response prevention. Maybe I'll mention one more paper since I'm talking about it. I just found this so fascinating. But Rebecca Etkin published a paper where she talked about findings showing, interestingly, agreement between children and parents on the level of accommodation were actually predictive of outcomes. So even looking beyond what is the level, it really mattered whether they're seeing it eye to eye. Or not, and I just kind of found that I'm not sure what to do with it.
A positive relationship, if you
high
eye to eye,
agreement was better. But I don't even know what to really take of it in terms of the clinical implications. But I do find it kind of fascinating that is the the case. But yeah,
I wonder if
No, go ahead.
I was just wondering if the mechanism there is when you think about the alliance, right? Task agreement is really important as a predictor of, does therapy work? If you and your family or your client are working together and all oars are pulling the same direction, maybe it's a similar effect there with parent-child agreement.
Maybe it goes back to what you were saying about expectancies and credibility of treatment, like how we feel about this treatment going into it really mattering to the ultimate outcomes. It's kind of part of the same picture.
Yeah. There's another thing I wanted to talk about just as families, because we haven't touched on it yet. And I wanted to talk a little bit about when OCD sufferers keep a secret what they're struggling with because they feel ashamed by it, or they feel it's not welcome, or maybe they are a bad person because they're having certain thoughts or feelings. And similarly, I think that a lot of the families we see feel extremely isolated. If they have somebody who's a sufferer, they don't feel like they can share that with others around them. And so there's an isolating effect where families often feel like they're alone on an island struggling with this, and there's nobody who really understands. And just one of the things that's so, so important that IOCDF does is to connect families with each other through their conferences, through things like this where we're talking about it openly, and to make a space for people who have OCD if they are feeling really frightened about sharing their symptoms, right? It is okay. We have all heard them, and it's safe to talk about these things and to kind of dispel that stigma around it. I just wanted to bring that up to see if we wanted to talk about that too.
I mean, I was on that topic thinking, like, is there a good way to broach that as a parent of a child with OCD? Like, how do you broach that topic and talk about, like, hey, I see you're struggling with this, and like, no, you haven't shared it with us yet, but we can see you're struggling with something. How do you approach that conversation in a way that's going to be productive and not lead to a flare up or a meltdown or what have you?
It's a great question.
This definitely makes me think back to something that we spoke about earlier, right? And we were talking about, family members, let's say parents, for example, who have their own anxiety, right? So we see this all the time in our multifamily groups, right? And I think let's just focus on parents, for example, although we do have family relationships of all different types. We see so many anxious parents who are struggling to connect with their, let's say, adult child. We see ages 17 and up at the OCD Center. So a lot of anxiety there and a lot of uncertainty as to like, how do we talk about this, right? And so I think one thing I really like about these groups is it does foster that sense of community that Lisa was talking about, right? And it is so incredible that a group that we thought would maybe be 6 weeks, it was, thinking psycho ed group, do a little behavior contracts, but like families are not going to want to stick around. We actually found families, for the most part, wanted to stick around, right? And just modeling from each other, hearing from each other in group. We'll do a spotlight on each family. And let's say on average, we'll have 4 to 5 families per group, but each family is hearing from the family that goes before them, right? And we often will see families chiming in and saying, I felt that, wow, oh, I thought I was the only one, right? So really incredible to just see within that family group a lot of learning happening and a lot of mutual validation. So basically this group is no longer a 6-week group. It is now a group where I would say on average, we've got folks there around a year, sometimes longer. We are collecting data. We're having family members complete the family accommodation scale every couple of months, which is helping us see the data is showing it is effective. But yeah, it's really become more of a community. And the last thing I'll say is a couple months ago, we created a monthly family maintenance group. So this is for family members who are no longer in our weekly group. They've met their goals, or we just don't have space. And we need space for newer families who need to really start implementing, and they've graduated to a monthly group. And that really just helps maintain the relationships that they've built in the group too.
I love that.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. And if anyone wants to learn more about this group, I will put a plug in for the article we wrote in the summer 2024 edition of the IOCDF newsletter. So you can just Google that.
If you have it handy and can send
you can drop it in the chat.
Actually, I'll drop it in the chat.
There you go.
Have it handy.
This is okay. Tom asked a question, and then I want to move on to talk a little bit about siblings, and then if we have time, like couples and relationship or OCD in a couple. But I'll get to Tom's question first. For adult children with severe OCD who struggle to be independent, what can parents do when they can't support them anymore if they're too old or for any reason? And I was thinking of a question along a similar line, which is like, if you have an adult child with OCD, like Christine, you work with, ought parents step in, or is it kind of on the adult child at that point to go ahead and take the reins of therapy themselves? So 2 different questions, but similar flavor.
So, on my end, when I work with adults or families of adults with OCD, these are active conversations that it's really important to have, right? About, let's think about where this is going to go. If in 5 or 10 years you are ready to go into, for example, assisted living, or there's funding that's drying up, what is going to happen, right? And I think it's really important. There's so many different levels and so many different ways to intervene with families and to be supportive, but that's a really important conversation to have, and it's very real, right?
Mhm.
And so is there an answer? No, other than voice it and create a space, right, to have that conversation, to really think about, like, how are we going to make plans for this? What do we need to do? And for some of my adult clients, that has been very motivating, right? And they will start to be more self-directive, engage more in doing things. And that's been a nice thing to see.
Yeah, I think making plans is, I think you said, like, making plans, and I think that's kind of key, because too often you start having that thinking of, like, wait, what about after, we're getting older, or we're moving to fixed income, and, like, we can't do this,
Right.
or we won't be around forever, or, like, those thoughts, they come, but after a long period of being in a very kind of, like, stuck situation where you were able to sustain it, and therefore did sustain it. And I think if I were talking to a family who's in that earlier phase, I would say you kind of do have to think ahead, because it is not wise to assume that this will just resolve by itself without some really directed energy and effort putting into creating change. Time, just slips by. And not only is it not necessarily going to resolve itself, but the longer somebody is in a situation where they are, very impaired by their symptoms, limited by their function is lower, actually the harder and harder it gets to really be able to climb out of that. Mm-hmm. Not impossible, but harder. And so trying to think about it earlier, and to both make plans, but also take steps to think about, what are the things, for example, what are the things that I say as the parent of this adult, what are the things that I am providing that may be more aligned with my child's lack of function than they are with the idea of my child functioning better? And can I change those things? I can't decide for my child that they're going to start working really hard in their therapy. I can't decide that. I can't even usually decide that they'll be in therapy, because they're an adult and it's not really up to me. I can't decide that they're going to get up and start, doing X, Y, or Z, but I can decide to change some of the things that I'm doing, right? Mm-hmm. Some of the things that are more under my control, and that might be lending more of a megaphone to the voice within my child that is saying I can't, rather than to the other voices within my child that are saying I wish I could. And so trying to start doing that work earlier, rather than waiting until it is like, oh no, like, we need a solution, because, like, this, now we're at this, like, late point, I think is, let's just say it's wise to do that earlier.
And I think too, when we talk about how early, right, I often see parents very, very, they're struggling when kids turn 18 and it's no longer under their control, some of the decisions that they wish they could make. And I can tell you, we have treated, and we have a really solid evidence base on treatment for OCD as young as 4 years old, right? From the pediatric OCD treatment studies on the family-based models that they use, where the population in that study was aged 4 to 9 years old. And so if families are thinking, well, maybe this is just developmental, maybe it's just a phase, that's a great question to bring to a provider who can actually look at that and help you decide and help you determine whether this is a normal developmental ritual, or actually we're we're leaning into maybe some OCD where we could intervene earlier to see if we can gain back some flexibility for this kiddo so that they don't have that cascading issue of like falling out of their social groups and their academic progress and falling further and further behind in their lives developmentally.
Yeah, there's definitely more to say, but I want to make sure that we hit a little bit on sibling stuff, because there's, again, so much to talk about with an OCD in the family. When you are the sibling of someone with OCD, what's kind of the likelihood that you may have OCD, or how does that kind of affect your psychological development? I'm sure it's got to be incredibly stressful.
It depends. I mean, there's a lot of data on sibling-based programs where you have a typically developing kiddo with a child, not just with OCD, but other chronic mental health issues or physical conditions that impact the family. And families have limited resources. And so sometimes what happens is the resources all go to the individual who's suffering with OCD. So it's really important to notice, and make sure that there's an equitable response and that there's time for the kid. Even, and of course, it's a closed system and resources may be thin, right? But it's important to notice that, again, like what we started with is OCD is, it's an interpersonal process and it affects everyone in the family, whether they are the sufferer or whether they're a family member.
Yeah, it's a great question, Kyle. In our current family group, we actually have two sisters. They are in their 50s and 60s. And for the longest time, the OCD sufferer didn't know that she had OCD. And it was just a really interesting dynamic that growing up, her older sister was just always, going out of her way to help her younger sister. Just felt like, well, this is what my mom did growing up, and I just want to make my sister feel better. I want to, do things for her. That's just how I show my love, right? And it's really interesting because we've been able to talk about this dependency even outside of OCD that the OCD sufferer has learned from just how she was raised and how her siblings saw her. And it's been really cool to see the sister without OCD allowing for herself to feel anxiety about the younger sister who suffers with OCD, but to just allow that younger sister to do things for herself. And older sister loved traveling and had stopped traveling to cater to her younger sister and is very happy to be back to traveling the world. Yeah. So that's just like a really cool thing. Yeah. And again, these are we're talking decades of like, this is just the dynamic in their family.
Is that like empirically the archetype siblings find themselves embodying? Like I'm kind of going to grow up a little bit quicker, act like a parent, and provide for this person struggling with OCD?
Well, I think that, it depends on the context of the family. And if that's what you learned, that's all you know growing up, that my sister has, a problem and our family is about taking care of this one person, then you could embody that, and internalize that. And that's who you kind of take over for your parents, because that's all you know.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
Yeah, and the older sister does not have children of her own, and so has spoken about how even more so she wants to take on that caretaking role. And like Jon was saying, that's just what they learned in their family, right? Like, this is how you show your love.
Right.
So the two of them have come a very long way.
And of course, what's interesting and cool is that now she's by helping her sister to be more independent, she's really showing her love.
Exactly.
And instead of protecting her, she's supporting her, as Ellie would say.
Yeah, but I think it's also worth noting that there are those instances where, like, you're very caring or you're very parentified or very responsible and you want to provide the accommodation, but there can also be elements of coercion within family systems. Not all accommodation is quite so willingly given. It can also be quite forcefully imposed by one family member on another. If you are going to be subjected to rage, to aggression, to violence, to various, forms of coercion
Threats.
you don't accommodate, then you might find yourself doing it a little bit less happily and yet still be doing it. And that can also lead to a lot of resentment, building up within that, within that relationship. So you might still be doing the accommodation, whether that's a child who's accommodating their sibling, or whether you're an adult who has taken on and shouldered the burden of accommodating maybe your adult sibling. And sometimes you need a lot of help from the other members of the family, from your support network, or from your professional helpers, therapists, etc., in order to be able to actually step aside and put some healthier boundaries on what you are providing for your sibling who is legitimately ill and suffering, but maybe is leading to a very problematic demand or coercion on you.
Mm-hmm. Eli, I was wondering, is there epidemiological data about the siblings of folks with OCD? It's clear that it's going to depend on the context within the family, but their rates of different disorders.
I don't think. Well, not so much. My memory might be wrong, and you guys correct me if I get this wrong, but I don't think that there is for siblings. I think there's parents to child, but I don't know that there's higher epigenetic.
I think there is actually I think there is some epidemiological, not on the accommodations. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the actual risk for mental health problems among siblings of among siblings of people with OCD. Yeah. There are elevated rates, not even only of OCD, but as often happens with psychiatric problems, you actually see, if I can dig up that paper, I will too. I don't have a lot of very new data, but I have seen research. And so you see elevated rates, first of all, in the OCD cluster, meaning you see OCD elevated rates, but also Tourette's or other tic problems, as well as anxiety, mood, attention. There is some. I don't think there's a ton of studies, but there is some data on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my hunch would be that that stressful family system could bring about some sort of reaction in the sibling, but I didn't know if that was like empirically verified. What's the data?
But not to say specifically that it's a fact. Like we don't that to still differentiate from the cause. Is that just a genetic thing that is playing out? So I'm not trying to attribute any causality to the why those rates are elevated. But sorry.
Exactly.
What are the risk rates if you have a parent with OCD?
They're higher.
Well, yeah, but
and it goes reverse. You're more likely 1 in 2 chance to have. If you're a child who struggles with OCD, it's much more likely that you might have a parent who is also struggling with OCD.
But let's be clear that doesn't necessarily mean genetics.
Correct. That's exactly right.
I'm Jewish. My parents are both Jewish, right? I speak English. My parents both speak English. So that is something, the environment, I learned how to be Jewish. It's not a Jewish gene. I learned how to speak English. It's not an English gene. So, and a lot of people make that mistake of saying, well, OCD runs in families, so it must be genetic. That is not necessarily the case. A lot of things run in families that are clearly not genetic.
I mean, are you suggesting you can see your parents acting in a OCD-like manner and then develop, mimic that such that you end up getting the disorder?
I am suggesting that it's not that simple. I think that
exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I think
not that simple.
but you learn certain ways to think about the world and threat and uncertainty and how you model behaviors that we see. And I think, like we were talking about earlier, that's certainly not the only thing. Mm-hmm. But that in combination with other factors, maybe some of them biological, maybe some of them environmental, that certainly, you have people that will pretty much say, you know, in our family, we learned, you know, such and such about, you know, uncertainty, or such and such about the risk of punishment from, you know, God, or things like that. And I internalized that. And so now I'm afraid of such and such.
I think the dog is reminding me that I actually have another meeting that I have to be on.
I have to go catch a plane.
I'm so sorry that I have to actually make it like a little bit of a hard stop. So you don't all have to stop because of me, but so thank you so much.
Yeah, no, I was gonna wrap it up anyways.
About time. Yeah.
We are at time. We have more that we could discuss. Ellie, feel free to leave while I'm doing these kind of closing
Thank you so
announcements.
much, guys. Bye.
Thank you. Good to see you, Ellie.
The ICDF is a donor-supported nonprofit organization, so please consider making a donation. We would also appreciate donations for research funds. If you donate directly to support studies to advance our understanding and treatment of OCD and related disorders, you can get a limited time I Love Research sticker or an I Love Research bag, and you can go ahead and make those donations at icdf.org/donate -research. I feel like we covered a good amount of things, but I feel like there's a lot more that we could have covered. Thank you both, Lisa and Christine, for joining. Jon, thanks for being here like always. And yeah, for everyone watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next month.
Great to see everybody.
And
Take
thank
care,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.